Moving on to our second trade, we saw Rondo go to the Clippers as Kawhi Leonard has literally been crying for a point guard all season long in exchange for Lou Will going to the Hawks. Rob, talk to me. How did they do on this trade?
They did decent for what they were trying to do. I'm gonna tell you this though. I think flat out Lou Williams is a better player than Rajon Rondo. Now, as far as fit, you could kind of argue to me that Rajon Rondo is a better fit as of right now. As we talked about, the Clippers needed a point guard right now. I think Paul George leads the Clippers in assists with like 6 assists per game, and Kawhi Leonard is number 2 on that team. So, of course, that's really not what you want. Those two players, they have to be your scorers. You want a point guard to actually get them the rock, and of course, Rajon Rondo is going to be able to do that. But I'm not going to lie to you, man. When we talked about Lou Will, we always thought about Lou Will as the closer. Of course, we understand Kawhi can close. Paul George is a very huge question mark, especially in the playoffs. So we don't necessarily know exactly if he can actually close. But everybody else, it's a real question mark. If Kawhi Leonard is not hitting in the playoffs in one game per se, which could possibly be a very huge game, Rajon Rondo is not stepping up hitting big shots. Lou Williams would have actually stepped up and hit those big shots. The problem that I have with this deal though is I think Rajon Rondo is a little bit overrated. Now, hear me out. Rajon Rondo is a very good player. He's going to fit well. He's going to fit more than Lou Williams fit. Rajon Rondo is not completely garbage. But I think playoff Rondo is a little bit overstated. I mean, especially in the finals. Looking at the statistics, he averaged 8 points, 5 assists, and 5 boards. I mean, off of 38% from the field and 33% from the three. Now, those numbers, they're not great. I mean, the only number that you really like to see right there is the 5 assists. And of course, not a lot of minutes. And plus, it's 26 minutes per game. So 5 assists in 26 minutes is not necessarily terrible. But the other things, though, I mean, he's going to be almost a complete zero on offense. Now, of course, he's going to hit some big shots, but it's not going to be nearly the offensive production as like a Lou Williams. Defensively, I mean, Lou Williams was a complete zero. Rajon Rondo is probably going to be better than that, but he's not going to be a better defensive player than Patrick Beverly. So in a lot of the clutch possessions on defense, you're going to possibly sub Rajon Rondo out for Patrick Beverly. I just don't necessarily think it was completely worth it. I get what they were trying to do, but Rajon Rondo, especially playoff Rajon Rondo, is a little bit too overstated. I think they could have definitely held it down and stayed with Lou Williams and, of course, steadied the ship. Now, of course, you understand that you don't necessarily want Paul George leading your team in assists, but it's still looking very, very dim with a player like Rajon Rondo, who can't necessarily do anything else. He's not necessarily an exceptional defender. He's not necessarily an exceptional shooter. He can't necessarily make a lot of layups and stuff like that. It just seems like you're now making yourself a little bit too one-dimensional, where you're going to have to heavily rely on Kawhi Leonard. You're going to have to heavily rely on Paul George scoring-wise. What do you think?
I got to disagree a little bit. And here's why. First, I think this was the most well-balanced trade of the day. I think that both teams actually won this trade, a win-win situation. I think that when you brought in Rondo for Atlanta, coming into the season, it was one about him getting a payday, and two, they wanted a mentor for Trae Young. But you got to ask yourself, I mean, at this point, I'm willing to say Trae Young is better than Rondo has ever been, even in 08. Great player, but this man, Trae Young, averaged 29 and 10. And defense is really about heart and getting your body right. So at the end of the day, I mean, that really wasn't what they needed. And when you look at last year as well, when you say, playoff Rondo, and you just read me what you say, you averaged like 8, 5, and 5 in the playoffs. I think it's going to be a little different because with this team, he's going to be the best playmaker on the court at all times. Whereas a lot of times he will be playing alongside LeBron, and Rondo, let's not mince words, he's no shooter by any means of the imagination. Rondo, like you said, he's actually a deficit on offense when you look at it. But I think that Rondo adds a lot of veteran leadership, which I hear they need in that Clipper locker room, because Kawhi's a quiet guy, and Paul George, a lot of guys get upset with the special treatment that he gets. So I think that Rondo being in there is going to help them. He's going to mature them in a sense, but also be able to play make along with add defense to that perimeter. Now, as far as Lou Will goes to the Hawks, I love that move. I love that move so much. See, the thing about the Hawks is they're going to make the playoffs. That's kind of what you brought Rondo in, just to see how far you can go. But, I mean, when you can add another 20-point-per-game scorer to come off the bench when when Trae Young goes on the bench, I mean, that's amazing, because when you think about it, you have Bogdanovich and you have Gallinari. Those two alone, they can drop 20, any given night. You add Lou Will to the mix, what they're going for is a lot of offense. When you look at the Nets, man, that's who everybody is chasing. You got to be able to put up the points with the Nets. I don't think anybody lost this trade. I think they both won this trade respectively for their teams.
Yeah, with Atlanta Hawks, I mean, I completely agree. I'm scared of Atlanta. I'm not gonna lie to you. We talked about this last podcast. Last podcast, they won 5 straight games. Of course, they're not necessarily on the winning streak right now, but the coach with the personnel that he has, it seems like a scary combo. Nate McMillan, he's a very defensive-minded coach. He slows the pace down, very conducive to playoff style of basketball. I talked about this a lot, but with that, and also you take into account that you have bona fide scorers. You talked about Trae Young, now Lou Williams, Gallinari, Bogdanovich. It seems like a very scary combination. I don't know, man. That team right there is definitely going to be one that I'm going to be a little bit afraid of, especially for the upper echelon teams. Let's say they're like a 7th seed. I wouldn't necessarily be too surprised if they beat a 76ers or even take the 76ers. It's like a 6 or 7 game series. I'm not going to lie to you. That right there seems to be something different. But the thing about Nate McMillan is that he was basically fired from the Pacers because he couldn't necessarily perform in the playoffs. I personally thought it was a little bit too soon, mainly because he lost to Miami Heat without Sabonis, and of course we understand Miami Heat went on to the finals, so of course you can't necessarily fault him for that. But previous series he basically got swept a lot. So you don't really know exactly how his playoff resume is going to stack up. We talk about other coaches like Budenholzer, very good in the regular season. Nate McMillan also very good in the regular season. But when playoff time comes, we don't really know exactly how good it's going to be. But as far as this trade, I mean, Lou Williams to Atlanta is probably going to be a little bit dangerous, man, because, Lou Williams with his lemon pepper wings in Magic City. But I think offensively it's going to be a very, very good mix. But, I mean, I ain't going to let you cop out, though. Who won this trade? Who won this trade?
Oh, the Hawks. I gotta go with the Hawks. The long answer to this would be because they're in the East, so it's going to be a bit easier. Besides the Nets, you have a bona fide 20-point per game scorer. Playmaking is cool, defense is cool, but this is an offensive league. You got rid of Rondo. You brought in a 20-point per game scorer, a veteran who you can count on to get you buckets when guys are either cold or their head's not right. I mean, it's close. I would give it 51-49 in this trade to the Hawks. But yeah.
I mean, I agree with that too. I mean, my reasons is 100% similar to yours. I think Rajon Rondo to the Clippers isn't necessarily the best of fits just because of he's not necessarily complete, but he's not necessarily that great offensively, scoring wise. Playmaking is definitely very good. But I want to ask you another question.
Talk to me.
Where are the Clippers right now? Where do you think the Clippers is right now in terms of the Western hierarchy? Because last year we thought the Clippers were the runaway favorite. Well, not necessarily runaway favorites because LeBron James was there, but roster wise, they by far had the best roster in the West.
I get you.
Now, do you think they're now in the upper echelons that could potentially compete with the healthy Lakers team?
Not at all. Not at all. The thing about the Clippers is, like you said, Paul George is just a big question mark. I mean, the second best player on your team is Paul George. That may sound great in the regular season, but we've seen what he does in the playoffs. The drop off is he's not even Paul George anymore. We don't know who that guy is. And they, but
Pandemic P.
Yeah, Pandemic P is a real thing. And then you also have to take into account, unless they get like Andre Drummond or LaMarcus Aldridge, they need a big desperately. I know they got Serge Ibaka and Zubac. Those two aren't going to get it done for you. You need somebody down in the paint that's not soft, somebody that's willing to do the dirty work, get the rebounds, bring physicality. And that's why I think Andre Drummond, I pray we're gonna touch on Andre Drummond, but that will be somebody that they should look at. Or even a guy like JaVale McGee who got dealt earlier back to Denver, So if I had to tell you where I would put them, I mean, I would have Phoenix over them, of course, healthy Lakers, Denver could take them, Jazz could take them, and even Portland, man. Like, I would give you those 5 teams that could catch the Clippers in a series.
No, I mean, I 100% agree. I mean, the big man is a very huge question mark. I mean, look at the last playoff series. I mean, when they went against Denver, Kristaps Porzingis was destroying them with one healthy MCL. Got to the second round, Nikola Jokic was basically terrorizing them. It didn't look good. I mean, it was terrible. Now, I get it. We look at Serge Ibaka as a very good defender, but I just don't necessarily think he's going to be able to stack up against players like, Nikola Jokic. I mean, I don't think anybody could really shut him down, anything like that. But I think you need a little bit more girth to actually suppress Jokic. And I think, of course, another player like that, we're going to get into that, could potentially do that. But as of right now, I agree. I don't think they're going to be, anything too crazy in the playoffs. They're not necessarily going to be a favorite for me.